I think it's terribly unjust, and the injustice done to us has never really been acknowledged. I mean, standing here in front of the house I was born in, and that my family owned.
The year is 1992. The first Intifada is in its fourth year, and the Palestinian uprising has brought international attention to the plight of Palestinians, demanding an end to Israeli occupation. The world-renowned Palestinian-American academic Edward Said stands outside the house where he once lived in Dahlabiyah, Jerusalem, 45 years after the 1948 Nakba violently displaced 750,000 Palestinians, including his own family.
I mean, I want the Israelis to understand that all of us were driven out from places like this. This is our history, and it remains, whether they like it or have tried to forget it or not.
By this time, Said was already a prominent academic, best known for his groundbreaking work, Orientalism, which challenged Western perceptions of the East and laid the foundations for post-colonial studies. His childhood home in Jerusalem stood the same, but it was now occupied by a right-wing Christian fundamentalist and militantly pro-Zionist group. For the Palestinian advocate, the experience of returning home only to find it inaccessible brought into focus the pain of dispossession and exile that defined the lives of Palestinians. A year after Said's visit, the Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, a move the cultural critic labeled a betrayal of the Palestinian people. He was criticized and vilified throughout his life, including by Palestinian leaders, who briefly censored his writings due to his outspoken criticism of their failings. In 2003, Said died of leukemia, aged 67. But 20 years after his death, as Israel's settlement expansion has rapidly accelerated to now house 700,000 settlers, compared to 250,000 in 1993, and as Israel's war rages on in Gaza, his ideas, critiques on Palestine, Israel and Zionism are proving to be more and more precise. So who exactly was Edward Said, and how is his legacy prevalent today?
My childhood memories of Jerusalem are of a small mixed city, an even smaller Anglican community, peaceful and pleasant, with only occasional reminders that all was not well.
Edward Said was born in 1935 in West Jerusalem to wealthy Palestinian Christian parents. At this time, this entire piece of land was an entity called Mandatory Palestine, ungoverned by the British as mandated by the League of Nations. The Said family fled their home in Dahlabiyah in December 1947 and sought refuge in Cairo, where they had opened a branch of their family business years prior.
Most of my family left Jerusalem because they had to. Our house was in an area that was totally unprotected, and it was in an area that fell to the Haganah in, I think, February of 1948. There was, to my recollection, there was no militia, there was no organized resistance of any sort. There were homeowners in a prosperous but sparsely settled Arab suburb of West Jerusalem.
By the late 1940s, Said attended Victoria College in Cairo, where his classmates included the future King Hussein of Jordan and actor Omar Sharif, before enrolling in an elite prep school in Massachusetts, US. He was a graduate of Princeton and Harvard universities and taught as an English lit professor at Columbia and Harvard. Said was not only a distinguished scholar, but also passionate about culture and the arts. A concert-level pianist, he had a deep appreciation for music and a love for poetry and literature. Later on in his life, he held close friendships with the likes of celebrated Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. During his early years as a promising young academic in the US, Said described himself as a creature of an American and even a kind of upper-class WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant education, who was somewhat distant from political issues of the Middle East. But then came 1967. In a war with Egypt, Jordan and Syria, Israel seized the remaining Palestinian territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, as well as the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. In a matter of 6 days, the Nakba, or setback, was seen as a continuation of the Nakba, and an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. For 31-year-old Edward Said, who was in New York on the day war broke out, his world was shattered, and this moment became a turning point for the young intellectual.
The world, as I understood it and knew it, had completely ended at that moment. And shortly thereafter that I began for the first time, I'd been in America already for 15 or 16 years, and I began for the first time to be in touch with other Arabs.
Mass media coverage in the United States portrayed the 1967 war as a proxy victory from Americans, framing it as a triumph of the enlightened Western civilization over the barbaric East, of the heroic underdog Israel swiftly defeating the surrounding Arab armies which threatened its existence. It was essentially a battle of good versus evil. By contrast, many Arabs in the United States experienced the June War as a travesty and sparked what's been dubbed as the Arab-American awakening. Said was part of this awakening and published his first political essay in 1968, An Arab Portrayed,
in response to Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir's views on Palestinians. In 1969, she famously said, "There are no Palestinians."
The essay was a critique of how Palestinians and Arabs are misrepresented in Western media and scholarship, and it launched a lifetime of writing and activism, paving the way for his most infamous publication, Orientalism, in 1978. In it, the Palestinian academic explained how Westerners, or Orientalists, since Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt, perpetuated stereotypes of the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia as inferior and barbaric. Said argued that these views, promoted by artists, thinkers, and scientists, create a racist worldview that can be used to justify imperialism and colonialism.
It's a tragedy, virtually impossible for an American to see on television, to read books, to see films about the Middle East that are not colored politically by this conflict, in which the Arabs almost always play the role of terrorists and violent people and irrational and so on and so forth. I mean, the idea, for example, that Hamas terrorists on the West Bank are just interested in killing Jewish children is what you derive from looking at this stuff. And very little attention is paid to the fact that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has been going on for 30 years. It's the longest military occupation in this century. And so you get the impression that the only problem is that, you know, Israeli security is threatened by Hamas and suicide bombs and all the rest of it. And nothing is said about the hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians who are dispossessed and living miserable lives as the direct result of what Israel has done and is doing.
Orientalism went on to become one of the most influential scholarly books of the late 20th century. Its arguments expanded the fields of anti-colonial and post-colonial studies. The book is still on curricula all over the world and catapults Said into becoming one of the leading thinkers of his generation. At a time when Arabs were portrayed as backwards and barbaric, Said sought to humanize Palestinians and become one of the most eloquent and influential voices advocating for Palestinian rights and self-determination in the international arena. He supported the two-state solution and was elected to Yasser Arafat's Palestinian National Council in 1988 as an independent. But in 1993, his relationship with the Palestinian leader changed significantly after the Oslo Accords were signed, marking an end to the First Intifada. Whilst the world believed that the infamous handshake on the lawn of the White House was a precursor for peace in the region, Said was scathingly critical and famously called it an instrument Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles. The Accords, which were meant to bring about a Palestinian state alongside Israel, only granted the Palestinian Authority control in a limited area of the internationally recognized 1967 Palestinian borders and failed to stop ever-expanding Israeli settlement buildings. By the late 1990s, Said believed that the only way for Palestinians to have equal rights was to have a single state for both Israelis and Palestinians. He was extremely critical of Israel's settlement expansion policy and the impact it had on Palestinian life.
And it's constantly expanding. There's a military post on the other side of this hill. For the last several days, they've been living without shelter, and their plight is, well, I think the only word for it is tragic, is disastrous. And this, in essence, is the Palestinian tragedy, that daily uprootings, daily evictions, daily destruction of property and homes takes place, and people are powerless to do anything about it.
This is inhuman and unjust, you know it. You're a decent person, I can tell. These are poor people, you're taking their land away from them. You know that to be true. You don't feel that, huh?
Said's activism often provoked accusations of extremism and the FBI kept a 238-page file on him. In 2000, a terminally ill Said was pictured throwing a stone from Lebanon towards the Israeli border. His detractors used it as evidence that he was a professor of terror, but Said said it was a symbolic gesture after the end of Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon. There were calls for his censure at Columbia, but the university took no action.
It's very, very hard for me to stand here talking about it when I see my own people going through this endless calvary without any relief, without any sympathy or support from the so-called civilized world, which backs Israel in these barbaric, inhuman practices.
He died of leukemia aged 67, but his legacy lives on 20 years later.